Jack, is that you? How many years has it been?
And now 3 fire-grilled meals are each under $3.
Welcome to paradise, soldier. Medal of Honor, Rising Sun.
One surprise after another. Adventurous Carrie romanced by the kind of blonde that gets into a man's blood, even if she has to shoot her way in.
Major Tom, you've really...
This is Operation Final War.
GPS ないし、両方欲しいって買わんかい。
I'm out. Me too. Man, Justin, what's the deal, dude? What you doing?
SOCOM 2, U.S. Navy SEAL.
I alone have the 5th freedom. The right to do whatever it takes to ensure that your 4 freedoms are protected and preserved.
Being fired now in Baghdad. I want our viewers to listen in.
Okay. All right, I didn't say it.
Hello, and welcome back to Part 5 of Intruder, Metal Gear and the Medium. I'm your host, Jorin Lee. Be sure to check out my channel on Patreon, like, and subscribe. I'll be posting material from the making of this video as a Patreon exclusive, so please check it out. In tonight's entry, we'll be looking at the last Metal Gear game for the PS2, 2004's MGS3 Snake Eater. Let's go.
What a thrill. Darkness and silence through the night. What a thrill. I'm searching and I'll melt into you. I give my life, not for honor, but for you. I'm still in a dream, Snake Eater.
Faulkner once said, "The past is not even past." And he may have been onto something. The time is 2003. America, truly for the first time since the 60s and early 70s, is now at war. The US invasion of Iraq, drummed up with dusted-off sheet music resembling strains of the Cuban Missile Crisis, all in the name of halting a madman from obtaining undetectable nuclear weapons, will prove to be a historic blunder, one based on false information, a virtuous spy story gone wrong, mired in the optics of petropolitics. Soon enough, comparisons will be inevitable to a very similar incident from the mid-20th century for the United Kingdom, the Suez Canal crisis.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
With the world now split into new kinds of East and West, with America's war machine roaring and all its metal gears turning like new, the logic and instincts of the Cold War make an inevitable comeback. It's the newest heir to the royal bloodline of the Second World War. And what's les enfants terribles nom de guerre? GWOT, the global war on terror. The place is Tokyo. Hideo Kojima, now age 40, is now vice president of the Konami subsidiary KCE Japan. And soon enough, he'll join the mother company's board of directors. They'll soon be calling his KCE Japan, the in-house Konami design bureau behind MGS1 and 2, Kojima Productions. Though synonymous with Metal Gear, Sons of Liberty will, according to reports less than 2 years old, be Hideo Kojima's last.
終了報告書とチェック終了報告書来ましたので、日本版無事終了ということです。あとプルーフがありますけども、とりあえずは制作のは終了ということで、お疲れ様です。
Back on September 28, 2001, just ahead of MGS2's stateside launch, its director had said the following, quote, I really think that Metal Gear has to live on in some form, but as I said at the end of Metal Gear Solid, I really think it's time for me to hand over the director role to someone else. I might do the initial planning for the next game, but not much more. And then later in the same interview, quote, throughout this Sons of Liberty project, I really tried to embody that theme of passing knowledge on to the next generation. These guys all have great ideas. Hopefully they can take what I've passed on to them and blend it with their own values to create a whole new kind of Metal Gear created by them, not me. Back then, what early ideas for Metal Gear Solid 3 he had were intended, as he stated, merely to be handed off to KCE Japan for them to tackle solo. Kojima formed these initial concepts while the staff, celebrating MGS2, were out on vacation. But that had been 2 years ago. A lot can change, and fast, in historic times like these, the early 21st century. It may be 2003, but Kojima's style as VP of KCE Japan remains decidedly locked in the Showa age, and its defining icon, the salaryman. Work culture in Japan, when it's working well, sees the company almost like another family. And like the patriarch of any noble house, Kojima, clearly looking to move on from Metal Gear for some time, is also looking for an heir, a new director and future for the series after he's gone. There's just one problem. Kojima has pioneered, alongside other luminaries in his field, something called director-driven game design. The strength of DD is all the unique off-the-wall ideas and revolutions that it affords. The weakness? Even as a group effort, ultimately DD-type projects by necessity live and die by their director. It's not something exactly easy to just pass along. Then there is the question of Metal Gear's roots, a topic of refrain for us tonight, as we'll see. This series was born at the end of the Showa era, which lasted in Japan from 1926 to 1989. Metal Gear was forged, among other flames, from the fires of an apparent 1980s-era new Cold War, and it was crafted according to memories mostly of one man, one born in 1963. Could something like that, like Metal Gear, be passed on to younger talents so easily? Perhaps out of a sense of almost maternal duty and sacrifice, or simply a practical desire not to see Metal Gear's brand diminish, Kojima realizes the only responsible thing for him to do before departing the series is to ensure everything about it, everything that can be, gets conveyed to the future, and therefore to its future post-Kojima developers, KCE Japan. Of course, Snake Eater would also be about the lessons that Kojima himself inherited from his parents. When he was young, famously, Kojima's parents made regular movie viewing mandatory, requiring the young Kojima to bring back from the movie theater the playbill of that day's film. From this lifelong obsession for movies to the themes of pacifism and anti-nuclear proliferation, Kojima was in his own way passing on traces of older generations too.
Oh, you're the intruder everyone's talking about.
So what state as of 2003 is the medium in? Xbox is busy making American video games great again, and the West's comeback to games follows 20 years of remission. In MGS2 Substance, released in 2002, produced right alongside the earliest stages of work on MGS3, minor tweaks were made to rework essentially the entire game. Surely this had to influence creating MGS3, given how Substance brought much more emphasis on the importance of gameplay dynamics, of deep and engaging game design meant for longer sessions of play and replay.
The enemy.
Damn the Patriots!
Both Substance and Snake Eater would, to varying extents, represent responses to the Western response to MGS2, and in particular its winding Byzantine plotlines and effete, effeminate second-player character, Raiden. The character of Raiden was designed around certain manga and anime tropes that were totally lost on the West, who only saw in him a girly man.
You still have some use.
Only recently, Metal Gear Solid as a stealth series was still the biggest name on the block, but now multiple rivals have arrived, from Splinter Cell on Xbox in 2002 to Thief 2: The Metal Age on PC, released in 2000. And now come the Attack of the Clones. A huge number of Western military action shooters proliferate, driven in part by the rise of early online gaming, the wellspring of latent American militaristic patriotism, and high-budget, realistic-looking single-player titles like 2002's Medal of Honor Frontline. That, however, is only in the West. In the East, in Japan in particular, trends in electronics are, for the first time in a decade, from the English-speaking world, diverging. Once it had been a question of mere platform availability, say the MSX in the East versus the Commodore 64 or Sinclair ZX81 in the West. The question now, though, goes beyond brands or platforms into different lifestyles, cultures. Irony of ironies, the split in the path traced back decades to 1981. That year, US President and California cowboy Ronald Reagan had spurred American advances into high-definition TVs, after seeing what had already been achieved by the Japanese. But by the early 21st century, America has completed its transition to an all-digital, high-def future of communication. And meanwhile, Japan has already moved on to something else: microelectronics. Kojima's countrymen and women care not for the giant burgers, televisions, consoles, and controllers so popular in the West. They're more into stuff that's small. Gacha toys, for example, or handheld games to play on the train. Thanks to miniaturization and microelectronics, Japan, for some time, has been heading this way, opposite America, towards ever smaller devices, thanks to ever greater processing power. The East goes handheld and portable, the West goes big screen and high definition. While Japanese games skew towards all genres and ages, the West nowadays, more than ever, skews, broadly speaking, towards the militaristic and the male. Conflict, it seems, isn't only in Iraq. Gaming now has on its hands all the makings of its own full-blown East-West cultural contest. It's to be a Darwinian struggle, a battle, survival of the fittest.
What a thrill, with darkness and silence through the night.
As natural selection shows, conflict isn't always or inherently bad. I mean, the Bible would be a pretty boring book if not for that first conflict in the Garden of Eden. But setting aside the carnal Judeo-Christian secrets between Eves and snakes, like pretty much everything else about human existence, conflict is more typically relative. No black or white, good and evil, but arguably just gradations of gray. And this is why, in fact, given the right context, conflict can be positively productive. Conflict can even drive the times. Back in the 90s had been the so-called console wars, Nintendo versus Sega, and then Nintendo versus Sony. The story of Sony turning on Nintendo to become its own biggest rival is a story of nothing but conflict and revenge. Yet that chain of retaliation made the PlayStation family of consoles possible and the medium overall better. So clearly, sometimes conflict has its perks. Even conflict is, like any other value, virtue, or sin, a relative thing. Perhaps one that changes with the times.
But the problem is balance.
Throughout the 1990s, conflict in the games industry had been internal to Japan, and Japanese companies like Sega, Nintendo, and Sony. Since the late 90s end of Console War II, though, thanks to the West's re-entry, the world of video games relative to design trends has now been essentially, as I said, split into two, East and West. And this marked the beginning of the next console wars. These conflict-laden times are to be the battlefield onto which Hideo Kojima's MGS3 Snake Eater will be born. Now several years into the 21st century, with the PS2 well established and the status of the medium on the rise, the world waits, its breath bated, for any news on Sony's next console, the PlayStation 3. The PS3 will be built around something called the Cell microprocessor, first devised in 2001. This tech-forward approach, similar to the strategy behind the PS1 and 2, will attempt to bridge the growing divide between English-speaking audiences/developers and Japanese ones. But it's unclear when Sony's big machine, its answer to the growing East-West video game arms race, will be ready for actual game development. In the meantime, with the PS3 somewhat on the back burner, Sony's focus is answering the market dominance of Nintendo in handheld games. Proving the newfound importance of such platforms in Japan, this year, 2003, Sony unveils its high-definition portable console, the PSP. It's the company's first handheld. Fascinated by the portability of devices like the PSP, called the Walkman of the 21st century by Sony's Ken Kutaragi, Kojima already has ideas for portable game design in mind. But those ideas will just have to wait. Despite Kojima's intent to depart from Metal Gear after Sons of Liberty, he's now hard at work directing MGS3, codename Snake Eater. At the forefront of this project, however, as evinced by MGS3's very first showing as a proof-of-concept video during E3 2003, will be the very thing even MGS2 Substance had lacked: dynamic, natural environments. Not mere objects, but a pseudo-sense of life. not mere substance, but subsistence. Building the future and keeping the past alive are one and the same.
Of course. Mr. Director, your time has finally arrived.
Thanks to MGS2, the series is immensely popular worldwide. Turning out lots of spin-offs and new versions of Metal Gear for new platforms would be a great way for the company to turn a quick profit. But Kojima, for his part, is not so short-sighted. Pachinko spin-offs and annual low-effort releases might bring Konami money, but only at the expense of the Metal Gear brand. And, for that matter, Kojima's reputation, his legacy, the boss's will. Quote, I do not intend to mass-produce side stories or spin-offs of MGS like franchises from other companies. The temptation from a business standpoint is there, but releasing too many titles weakens the brand. End quote. And again, Kojima would say in a different interview, quote, if I had wanted to release MGS3 within a year of MGS2, the easiest way of doing so would be to pick up where MGS2 ended, using the same engine and the same game system, even the same characters. I guess Electronic Arts and many other companies do this, but if I did that, it would be no fun at all. End quote. Initially, the Kojima-less Metal Gear Solid 3 had been conceived of as a PS3 title, but the console won't actually see the light of day for quite some time. So, KCE Japan returned to the PS2. Creating MGS3 will take them roughly 2.5 to 3 years, about as long as MGS2 had. But the challenge, though, will be even greater. Unlike the jump from MGS1 to 2 for MGS3, the team can't simply rely on a generational leap in hardware to guide their design, meaning they'll have to get much more creative, and the work will get harder. The game will have to get bigger and better than any KCEJ production before. Kojima will say about MGS3 sharing the same platform as before, the PS2, the following, quote, we're on the same console, but we still have to surprise people. And we couldn't do it with the previous engine because we pretty much maxed it out with Sons of Liberty. While we were creating Metal Gear Solid Substance, we made a brand new engine for the jungle environment of MGS3, which took a year. End quote. Why has Kojima, the legend, returned to Metal Gear and decided to build back up that private army of a studio of his one more time, and thereby let the twin legends of Hideo Kojima and Metal Gear Solid come back to life? Why has he returned to this series that made him from Tokyo to Times Square a household name? More than mere death threats, megalomania, or corporate pressure, it remains an open question whether anyone can lead a Hideo Kojima-class production but the man himself. And this is why, at this time it seems anyway, that Konami want essentially to clone Kojima, to teach the art of planning, designing, and writing his way to the next generation. This project was actually already underway by 2001's Zone of the Enders. Consequently, throughout this period of the early 2000s, KCE Japan expanded operations considerably. Having started with the arcade-friendly rhythm series Beat Mania back in the late 90s, and Metal Gear Solid Ghost Babel for the Game Boy Advance in 2000, Kojima's team are branching out to platforms other than Sony's. Months prior, while Kojima re-entered development on MGS3 and as a PS2 exclusive, it was MGS2's expansion pack, Substance, that brought the series for the first time to Xbox. This wasn't even the first Metal Gear to grace a Microsoft machine. MGS1 had been ported to PC back in 2000. And now, in 2003, several KCE Japan-related projects for Nintendo are underway. Like whaling Quakers during the American Revolution, the team doesn't want to choose sides in this new console war. After all, there are profits to be made everywhere. Kojima won't direct these Nintendo projects though, thanks to MGS3. But he will work closely with their design teams and directors, close enough to leave a mark, however faint the trace. There will be several Metal Gear titles for the PSP, but not one of them will be, at least for many years, a true blue Hideo Kojima game. Not so coincidentally, most of them won't be very good either. And the reason is simple.
What a thrill. I'm searching and I'm melting to you.
MGS3 will use yet another deceptive marketing campaign. Radio silence left the public perplexed as to the game's time period. We could see the same old Snake in the epic mind-blowing trailer from 2003, but he was clearly living like some sort of Neanderthal in a primeval forest, one that seemed to be almost outside of time and place. The trailer may have been sketchy on details, but what it clearly conveyed through many different hints was that MGS3 would be a survivalist battle spent stalking through a mighty jungle, and probably one from the mid-20th century. Here was the rough and tough, manly man role that English-speaking players, gauging from their reception of Raiden, really wanted to play. Hideo Kojima had already shown he could subvert and betray fan expectations, now he was actually going to deliver on them. Many features shown in the E3 trailer would not show up as depicted in the final game, of course. The trailer implies all sorts of things, like a real-time day-night cycle, giant spiders, and packs of hunting dogs snarling on our trail. We also see Snake seem to consume a giant anaconda in real time, as well as dense atmospheric fog. None of these things would be implemented exactly as shown, because the trailer is at best a proof of concept. But the concept that the trailer embodies will be executed exactly as shown, even if the team had to drop certain Kojima ideas like a day-night cycle and organic dynamic weather. An illusion of both would be in certain scenes carefully contrived. This marsh, for example, does feature patterns of rain and a bit of mist. Outside the complex of Graniny Gorky, there's a forest area that, like several other early locations, players will visit through the course of their adventure at different times of day. And the enemy really will use dogs, just not so many. MGS3 will be a living testament to Kojima's philosophy that in truth the world is one, and that the truth is relative to today's scene of the times. As always, these narrative themes will be inseparable from wider gameplay and overall design. This monistic philosophy is more than any other what to the next generation Konami cadre he feels most he must impart. Among that new cadre's ranks, Shuyo Murata. A key member behind Zone of the Enders in 2001, Murata just directed its much improved and more important sequel, Zone of the Enders: The Second Runner. The visual design of this game will have a clear influence on MGS3, down even to fonts, and in particular the look of its own giant robot, the Shagohod. Just look at Zone of the Enders 2's opening and its ice-draped tundra. It resembles the vast outdoor locales planned for MGS3, not to mention, obviously, Shadow Moses from MGS1. The studio has come a long way already from the 1990s. Murata, for his part, first cut his teeth on the Beatmania series, with a small credit also on 1995's Tokimeki Memorial Taisen puzzle drama. Murata will climb the ranks considerably, eventually becoming a full-fledged co-director and co-writer for several future mainline Metal Gears, starting with Metal Gear Solid 3, where he is billed as head co-writer alongside Kojima and a certain Tomokazu Fukushima, who we'll discuss in a second. Zone of the Enders 2 was a big game, and Murata's time in the director's seat will become crucial for his contributions to Snake Eater. The two games will be essentially cousins, even their map screens will look alike, and they'll also share very similar villains. Another important name is Shinta Nojiri. A member of Kojima's circle since the many Policenauts ports in the mid-90s, Nojiri will work as a writer and designer on many of these early 2000s era Kojima-related games. But maybe none of the names of these talents will become more widely known than the aforementioned Tomokazu Fukushima, mainly due to his prominent billing as co-writer in Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2 alongside Kojima. Following his departure by MGS4, some will mistakenly believe the rumors regarding Fukushima and his alleged crucial yet secret influence over the entire series. In reality, hardly the MGS saga's special sauce, Fukushima's actual job description merely involved research and writing dialogue for codec calls. It is Fukushima who most often tackles these many lengthy radio drama scenes. And it will be due to his absence that a later MGS, titled Guns of the Patriots, will contain far less radio calls. But Fukushima is hardly the one-man army that his legend persistently suggests. The same, of course, goes double, if not triple, for Kojima himself. And it is here that the Fukushima myth holds at least a morsel of truth. After all, no Hideo Kojima game is literally made by just Kojima alone.
There's no way you could have gotten this far all by yourself.
This, as we've seen, goes back to his earliest days working as a Japanese game planner. It is no one man but a group effort by an entire dev team that, under the banner of Kojima's name, makes with projects like MGS3 the impossible possible. Fukushima had actually taken a leading role making the first handheld MGS, the aforementioned underrated and underplayed Game Boy Advance classic from 2000, Ghost Babel, technically named in the West simply Metal Gear Solid. We saw earlier in Entry 2 the creation of the first non-Kojima involved Metal Gear back in 1990, Snake's Revenge. As KCE Japan's stature grows, several new Snake's Revenge-style non-Kojima-directed Metal Gears will follow, beginning with Metal Gear Acid in 2004, released only 1 month after MGS3. These games, by and large, will admittedly lack Kojima's signature auteur-adjacent flair for design, any deeper sense of his individual personality, or Kojima's memories, his hopes, fears, his pain, joy, and sorrow. But nonetheless, these non-Kojima projects will directly affect the course of his own signature work in the near future, and as said, some of these titles will still conceal hints of Kojima's special style. Apart from Zone of the Enders 2, in 2003 also comes another one of them, and maybe the most important one for MGS3.
Buckeye, the sun is in your hand! What a thrill. I'm searching and I'll melt into you.
Boktai for the Game Boy Advance will be the first all-new and original Kojima concept overseen by the boss himself, if at a distance, to wind up on any Nintendo machine. While MGS veteran Ikuya Nakamura tackles writing and direction, it is Kojima who first gives Boktai life, the sun to its plant, shining his influence over the game from afar as its producer and central conceiver. Despite this distance, this is a very personal game concept that could only come from Kojima's mind. And that, as we'll see, will be part of why, sadly, Boktai won't do nearly as well as it might have with him as director. The game idea's origins lie in Kojima's memories of childhood, during the age of flower power and sun rays, the 1960s, and the same we will see will hold true for MGS3. Cinematic influences on Boktai include many from the mid-century, chief among them the 1966 spaghetti western Django. Playing as a vampire hunting cowboy of the same name, Django, armed with a solar-powered firearm, the Gun del Sol, players in Boktai must charge Django's gun by physically taking their Game Boy out into the sun. The stronger the exposure to sunlight, the stronger the charge. Where did such an outlandish idea, one that proved difficult to sell even to Nintendo, come from? Well, we'll see in a bit where it came from on the technical side, but conceptually, it came from the same place as most of Kojima's ideas: a genuine desire to move the medium forward. Kojima will say, quote, handheld gaming has grown to be such a big thing, but looking at the software that's been released up till now, it's almost all stationary. It's portable, but basically you just plop down somewhere and play. The games haven't really leaned into the portable aspect very much, and it's more like having a portable TV than anything else. So I thought to myself, I want to make a game that can only be played portably, end quote. Boktai is also a byproduct of other mid-century films than Django, including Tower of the Sun from 1970, Season of the Sun or Taiyo no Kisetsu 1956, and Taito ga Ippai or Purple Moon from 1960. The concepts for Boktai come from a steadily growing arsenal of new ideas piling in Kojima's head, who again wanted to move on from MGS after MGS 1 and 2. The failure of Boktai to live up to his initial ideal illustrates something important. The way Kojima makes games has a downside. A Kojima clone army will never become a reality. Only the dreams of dreamers with the right stuff ever do.
小島作品が好きなようだな。いつも応援してくれてありがとう。
The personal, even idiosyncratic nature of his direction, planning, and writing all mean making a Kojima-class title without the man himself directing every step of the way is virtually impossible. And this explains another part of why Kojima decides for MGS3 to return. The early 60s setting is entirely rooted in Kojima's own experiences coming of age at that time, and that, as I said, MGS3 shares with Boktai. Take, for example, MGS3's foundations in the mid-century space race and 60s-era flower power naturalism. Commenting on his nostalgia for this era relative to Boktai, Kojima would say, quote, just getting out of Earth's orbit and seeing our sun from up there, I could die happy. Seriously, I wouldn't care if I couldn't come back. After my astronaut phase as a kid, the next dream I had was to work in animal conservation. Long ago, there was this old Japanese TV show called Yase no Okoku, or Wild Kingdom, that my dad loved. All he ever watched was nature and wildlife documentaries like that. In that show, there was this gruff old Tarzan-looking dude who would do stuff like wade into a swamp and catch an anaconda with his bare hands, and then take the animal back to a conservation center. It was pretty ridiculous, but I thought it was extremely cool. End quote. But of course, few of the younger developers at KCEJ during that long ago era of the 60s were even alive.
Jack, you can't come with us.
And this brings up a major focus for MGS3. History is only truly alive for as long as those who lived through it are, and nothing lasts forever. History, culture, politics, all of them mere human legends. Most of what we call fact is actually legend, and a legend is nothing but fiction.
Legend? A legend is nothing but fiction. Someone tells it, someone else remembers, everybody passes it on.
He's a living legend.
When the body dies, the will, memories, the senses all die with it. And that's why some icons are truly irreplaceable.
Life's end. Isn't it beautiful? It's almost tragic. When life ends, it gives off a final lingering aroma. Light is but a farewell gift from the darkness to those on their way to die.
Boktai involved the player in an organic environment, one that worked off our actual position, time span, and actions. Boktai, in every possible sense, was a clear forerunner to its cousin MGS3. Creating a game out of light, sim, and survival elements with setting, tone, and theme all derived from the 1960s. But no less of an influence on Snake Eater will be played by the second major project of this time, the GameCube remake of Metal Gear Solid 1 named The Twin Snakes. Remember how I said Kojima wanted to teach the youth about how the world is actually one? One example of this can be found simply in the then surprising, if not shocking, decision to hand over development on the GameCube remake of Metal Gear Solid to a Western studio, namely the one behind 2002's excellent horror title Eternal Darkness, the Canada-based Silicon Knights. A research trip for MGS3's diverse landscapes, consequently, will bring members of KCE Japan to Canada around this time too. Perfectly then, the development and production of Twin Snakes will span both worlds of game design, East and West. While Silicon Knights handle the programming and overall process of translating the PS1 original to this new design environment of the GameCube, KCEJ and Konami will handle big picture concerns and, more importantly, the direction of the GameCube title's cutscenes. To do so, Kojima, gaining more and more experience as a producer, turns to a real-life filmmaker, one in charge of the upcoming 50th year anniversary Godzilla feature, 2004's Godzilla Final Wars, one Ryuhei Kitamura. Initially, Kitamura plans on recreating the original game's cutscenes shot for shot like the good fan he is. Kojima tells him to forget it, and think of Twin Snakes instead as a total reinvention of MGS1 that will nonetheless maintain its predecessor's soul. The result is an extremely action-heavy version of MGS that will, in due time, leave some fans a little incredulous. But throughout production on these high-octane, over-the-top sequences was Kojima, soaking up from the veteran film director Kitamura everything he could. Many techniques he learns, Kojima will soon turn around and utilize for MGS3. In fact, the opening of Snake Eater will be rather deliberately styled after that of the Twin Snakes. Given the influence to be played on MGS3 by classic 60s films like The Great Escape and Planet of the Apes, it's no wonder the game will take a lot from a different series at this time, one very popular indeed in the East, named Ape Escape. Back in 1999, Ape Escape 1 had been the first PlayStation game to make DualShock analog controllers a requirement, utilizing both analog sticks in revolutionary ways. to finally move Sony titles out of the PSX design era. But the right analog stick didn't work the camera as you might expect in Ape Escape. Instead, the Ape series makes the right stick integral for gameplay, for directional actions and attacks. The perfect way to describe both Ape Escape and the upcoming MGS3 is they're both technicians games, with involved, unique controls that require players to, as it were, learn to crawl before walking or running. In 2021, nearly 20 years after this era, most games will be utilizing a much more standardized template for controls and genres. But at this time, around 2003, it's a bit like during the first era of home computing that had given us the MSX, or for that matter, the first wave of the Industrial Revolution back in the 18th century. Lots of fancy new next-generation equipment lying around, in other words, none of it adhering to a single standard. Ape Escape utilizes its controls in a way that sets out to challenge the popularity and quality of Nintendo rivals like Super Mario 64. Many Sony first-party titles had similar goals, but Ape Escape has what Crash Bandicoot, Gex the Gecko, and Spyro the Dragon all lack. Truly innovative controls, and a central game concept that can stand on its own, that isn't just a pale Mario imitation. The real title to look at for MGS3 has to be Ape Escape 2, released in Japan the summer of 2002. A quirky platformer with action-adventure, sandbox, and stealth elements, Ape Escape is a pleasantly playable game that borrows as much from Mario as it does from Metal Gear Solid and Pokémon. As the name suggests, in Ape Escape you catch monkeys, each with their own unique personality and traits. The game has a very off-kilter, wacky, even sometimes surreal tone, making it the kind of fare that can be enjoyed by more than just children. These apes escape our notice off the beaten path across large and mostly non-linear sandbox-ish levels, which require an increasingly complex and ever-growing number of monkey tools to track down. It is in these specialist tools and the technician's game that revolves around using them that makes Ape Escape's lineage with MGS3 so clear-cut. The apes even have an alert system, which you can gauge by looking at the light on the monkeys' heads. Ape Escape 2's English cast is directed by MGS1's original localizer Jeremy Blaustein, and the game features a suspiciously Foxhound-esque cadre of bad guys named the Freaky Monkey 5. But Ape Escape actually excels in types of game design that MGS has as of yet never even attempted. It will be thanks to Ape Escape's influence that elements in MGS3 like mild platforming, collect-em-all mania, and complex involved control mechanics, to say nothing of the verdant natural landscape, will appear. MGS3 will make the Snake and Ape Escape marriage official. A minigame will be designed so that kids can play their parents' cool new game Snake Eater without all the real games rated M for mature violence and sex. And this minigame will be a version, you guessed it, of Ape Escape. By Ape Escape 3 in 2006, direct references to MGS will become ubiquitous. But given the coming decline in the popularity of Japanese games, Ape Escape, unlike MGS, will never get to be a truly household name, at least not for very long. The same cannot be said for MGS3's other major influence, a rival title by a certain Rockstar Games, released in 2002 as one of the medium's first big banner releases set in a bygone era, Grand Theft Auto Vice City. In case the connection wasn't obvious, MGS3 will name-check Vice City explicitly in its very first proof-of-concept video at E3 2003.
何様のつもりだ。また車泥棒か？違う！潜入任務だ。ここは都会じゃねえんだからよ。ここはジャングルだ。ヘビでも食らいな。
From the Snake vs. Monkey minigame in MGS3 to all of Boktai and the jump with twin snakes onto the GameCube, clearly around this point, kids are on Kojima's mind. Kids and boyhood. The playful exuberance and jovial tone of MGS3's lighter moments will certainly speak to this, as does virtually everything about Boktai. Remember how I said MGS3 would have been impossible to pull off properly without Kojima directing? The perfect illustration is Boktai itself. He'll later say of it to Nintendo Power, quote, "In retrospect, this was a very challenging project to place in other people's hands," end quote. Though age 40, Hideo Kojima seems only to be beginning to flourish creatively, and some of his ideas remain simply too revolutionary to be feasible, let alone handled by other staff. And that, of course, had been true from the very start. This was still Kojima, the same man who had wanted to coat the discs of Snatcher in a heat-activated substance that would, fittingly for a murder investigation game, fill the player's room with the scent of blood. But now Kojima's infatuated with new ideas like utilizing smells or water and designing a game that literally breaks after meeting certain conditions. Hauntingly, on this point, roughly a decade later, a certain playable teaser, intentionally or not, will give Kojima his wish. But contrary to what such experimental outre ideas may suggest, Kojima is already more than his legend, the stereotype of the eccentric madman. Few realize or appreciate Kojima's role not only as a games director, but producer. His new responsibilities as a higher-up in Konami reflects the success that he has had with MGS1 and 2 as lead project manager. Ironically, Kojima actually majored in economics, purely, he'll say, to learn how to run his future creative endeavors as a business. These economic principles, making him such a capable producer, also at this point begin to more transparently than ever inform his game design, particularly at the systems level. Just as Kojima and KCE Japan are expanding into ever larger projects and different platforms, Kojima's games, even games he doesn't direct like Boktai, begin featuring systems dynamics in decidedly economic ways. As an idea, Boktai first solidified after Konami around 2001 unveiled a kind of proprietary medical sensor device. Realizing that in a game cartridge it had the potential to harness the power of the sun, Kojima envisioned Boktai as a kind of revolutionary open-world game, which makes things like sunlight, your current location, and real-world time of day all integral game dynamics. Those real dynamics that utilize the real world were central to Boktai's, if you will, mechanical economics. Kojima will say of this, quote, "I realized if the player could go outside and by moving around change his environment, the weather, the temperature, the terrain, and if those changes could be reflected in the game, it would be an experience unlike anything seen before. The key to all of it is the live element. Video games are a form of media in which the developer tries to create an experience that will bring joy to the player, and that's very common. But in doing so, there's an element of compulsion, of the player merely retracing the path the developer has laid out in advance. On the other hand, if you look at the success of online games today, a big reason for that is the sense that the experience is live. Yes, the creators have laid down a framework, but the experience is unpredictable and changes depending on who you play it with. I wanted to bring that live fun to portable games and create something where the environment and even the very gameplay change as you walk around. And Boktai is one answer to that larger inquiry," end quote. Boktai's ammo, which was solar-powered, became a kind of time-sensitive natural resource that players had to think about in more or less economic terms. This helped teach young people about the concept of planning for the future, of knowing that the sun will always rise again tomorrow. Systems fed into more systems in Boktai, like snakes eating snakes. You had to carefully consider what items and weapons to use and at what time. Boktai even contained a pseudo-survival mechanic which hinged on the player rationing out food, lest you be forced to eat something rotten or run out of supplies. Before defeating an immortal, one of the game's many undead enemies, Django has to drag that immortal's coffin back through the entire level, making memorizing its layouts and wisely planning ahead a must. The game also features a huge arsenal of possible weapons and attack types, somewhat similar on this point to the Nintendo series Kirby, which Boktai's players had to track down deep inside moldering caves, graves, and cathedrals, all perhaps to teach them the concept of scarcity. Boktai literally has a credit, debt, and banking system where players could borrow or save solar energy as needed and learn why saving is preferable to borrowing. It may have been targeted at kids, but with all these features and more, Boktai was surprisingly, if relatively, in-depth, or at least it was on paper. With young kids of his own, Kojima's careful, in his own words from Nintendo Dream magazine in 2003, quote, "about not making something that talks down to kids or treats them stupidly," end quote. While lighter and simpler than Metal Gear, Boktai contains a heavy, gothic storyline, reflecting perhaps Kojima's lifelong love for all things dark, broken, and twisted. It's not for nothing MGS2's Substance derived its name, like a certain black market store found in Kojima's earlier title Snatcher, from albums by the sister goth bands New Order and Joy Division, both of whom released albums named Substance. Boktai, with its weighty story combining sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, its vampires and mummies, is no exception to the Kojima goth rule. On paper, Boktai is another quintessentially Kojima game, yet, due to his necessary absence, it will never shine as brightly in reality as inside Kojima's mind. That may be because also the cultural differences between Japanese and Western consumers. For reasons already detailed, barring, say, Pokémon, handheld games are mostly a Japanese phenomenon, like visual novels, say, or eroge, aka erotic games. Two genres, consequently, formerly explored by Kojima's team as the Rising Sun exclusive Policenauts. But even if Boktai will never become like Metal Gear, a household name, its soul will live on as the skeleton for much of MGS3, not to mention hugely influence a later, much later game named Death Stranding. Boktai was made in light of Konami and KCE Japan's sister studio KCE East's new inroads into anime, and franchises like the ever-popular card series Yu-Gi-Oh! Boktai would spawn a successful manga all of its own, but its younger target audience and platform obviously also had to do with Kojima's budding relationship with Nintendo and Shigeru Miyamoto, right at the same time that Twin Snakes was being made. A month after Sons of Liberty, Nintendo had debuted Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, which in the West would prove controversial. Nintendo's Satoru Iwata and his Blue Oceans philosophy tried to bridge the gap between hardcore players and people on the periphery who didn't usually play many games. Increasingly, however, Nintendo, if not Japan generally, was beginning to find itself a stranger in the very land and medium that Japan itself had first originated, or at the very least, safeguarded, as the cultural boundaries between East and West are becoming more pronounced. Wind Waker's toony cell shading may have been a technical feat, but that was mostly lost on the game's many and vocal Western critics, turned off by its cartoon aesthetic. At this time, cartoons still meant something very differently to English-speaking audiences than to Japanese ones. The GameCube remake of MGS1, released right on the heels of the unbelievable 2002 remake of Capcom's Resident Evil, also followed the announcement of Resident Evil 4 as a GameCube exclusive. Clearly, Nintendo was trying to edge up its image, and Kojima was definitely part of that. Even the sunshiny Boktai, released the same year as the squeaky clean Super Mario Sunshine, was actually, as I intimated, about dark fare, about smiting vampires and worshipping the pagan power of the sun like an Aztec, all the while draped in the blood-flecked shawl of your own dead father. With these darker titles, Nintendo was signaling to its critics in the West that platforms like the GameCube could really compete with the likes of the PS2, the PC, or the Xbox. Boktai plays like a love letter, though, to the Super Famicom era, and to the pre-gaming epoch wherein Kojima was born and raised. Meanwhile, the Twin Snakes harnessed the basic design of MGS2 as Silicon Knights implanted inside it the story and scenarios of MGS1. But MGS1 was not the only series title to see a remake prior to Snake Eater, as I've hinted. Kojima is undeniably responsible for the growth of KCE Japan on the world stage. So why not direct these other titles himself? Why the push to create new Kojimas for the next generation? Well, no matter how little he sleeps or sees his family, one man cannot direct every single Konami or KCE Japan title, not even every Metal Gear. That's especially true for a medium with as much exponential growth as gaming, and a series with as much exponential popularity as Metal Gear. As operations expand, Kojima training an entire private army of mini Kojimas, in theory, maintains MGS's commercial viability, even in the wake of its originator's inevitable departure, not unlike the many different actors and directors behind the multi-generational spy series 007 James Bond. Now well established as a living legend in both East and West, no less mythically or fictitiously perhaps than Bond himself, Kojima will mentor these young talents, bringing a select few even into the MGS3 fold. As consequence of all these factors, MGS3 will be something of a Hideo Kojima return to form, a crash course on his style and design. Kojima, in one of the earliest interviews for MGS3 with GamePro, will say the following, quote, "As for the setting of MGS3, we wanted to change it drastically. Since MGS3 is the second MGS for the PS2, we had to do something drastic to surprise everyone. We also knew that the jungle is what we, the developers of MGS, fans, and people in the industry wanted. As for the story, it will be less complicated, and the main character will remain the same throughout the game." End quote.
Reckless boy. You don't deserve to meet your fate just yet.
Kojima grew up watching Godzilla and Taxi Driver side by side. He's seen enmity between world powers, including the US and Japan, rise and fall and rise again, an end to the times called the Showa era, and the start of a truly globalized 21st century. The game will emphasize our shared humanity by way of common ancestry with those solitary hunter-gatherer nomads known as Neanderthals, placing us in jungles reminiscent perhaps of an even earlier time of humanity's original homeland, the grassy, animal-laden plains of continental Africa. A quintessential title both for the series and its director, Snake Eater will very self-consciously evoke and play off trends from both East and West. It will convey both to players and Kojima's own developers that in reality, no matter the newest era or the next big war, all of us inhabit as one race and creed called humankind, one planet called Earth, whose oceanic blue eddies, as whales know no true bounds.
その時、私は宇宙からこの星を見た。そして全てを悟った。米ソは宇宙開発にしのぎを削っている。政治で、経済で、軍備で無意な争いを続けている。見ればお前にもわかるはず。
But the Earth itself has no boundaries, no East, no West, no Cold War. And the irony of it is, the United States and the Soviet Union are spending billions on their space programs and the missile race, only to arrive at the same conclusion.
21世紀には誰もが直視することになる。我々は地球という小さな星の住人であるという事実を。
A world without communism or capitalism.
それが世界のあるべき姿だ。
I'm not your boss anymore. There's nothing for you here. Go home. Go back to your boss. There's no need to prove that you are virtuous here. This isn't America.
Apart from re-establishing the Hideo Kojima and Metal Gear fundamentals, Snake Eater, like Sons of Liberty, will be a tech demo level title, a revolutionary new type of stealth simulation to boldly go where no developer has gone before. And as always, now fittingly for the third time, Kojima and KCEJ will set out to challenge prevailing industry and medium norms with this deceptively crowd-pleasing game, in the process making the impossible once more possible. The result, yet again, a full-fledged paradigm shift. 3, no different than MGS1 and 2, will fight against the times in which it is made. The original, back in 1998, first challenged the practice of prominent pre-rendered CG cutscenes. MGS2, second, had mutinied against limitations imposed by the industry's idea of a video game sequel and of the cinematic, all to push back against the medium's inferiority complex with Hollywood movies. So what will MGS3 do to keep alive its family tradition? What MGS2 was to sequels in modern Hollywood, MGS3 will prove to be to prequels and classic Hollywood. It will be a caliber of romance, passion, humor, tragedy, and action the world has never seen, using set pieces, Hollywood caliber stages, and stunts in ways that the gaming world has never known.
I will guide you to a world of anguish beyond your imagination.
But more than all this, MGS3 chose a jungle 60s era setting for reasons that went beyond connections to prior titles or sheer cinematicity. It was to be the one thing at this time that video games, and only video games, are thought incapable of, providing a feeling of the organic, the naturalistic, the alive. Earlier titles like, say, Donkey Kong Country or LSD Dream Emulator had achieved something similar to this well before 2003. But Snake Eater's high-tech approach to organic feeling environments and atmospheres is possible only now in the early 21st century. The first 3D animals ever made by KCE Japan probably went back to MGS1, but this was something that neither the series nor medium with MGS3 had ever seen before. Prior to this point, returning to a common theme last entry, environments in games were conceptualized mostly as set dressing, more or less by necessity. Level layouts betrayed their digital nature, just like, first established by MGS1, the shape that dictated all early 3D assemblages was the cube. As breathtaking as MGS2 even was, nearly every area or level followed a cubic structure, as you might expect for a real-time 3D series first formulated, after all, on Lego blocks. As the medium advances into the 21st century, Kojima's team recognized the blocky politics of the polygon must inevitably give way to something greater and much more pseudo-real. The more the player can be lured into suspending our disbelief, the better the overall illusion of hyper-reality. That's especially crucial given compared to movies, games are a lot more non-real. Not only the story, setting, and characters in games are fabrications, but everything else is too, including the people and places. Snake Eater will solve this by more than realistic natural landscapes or ecology. It will be a prequel, and as such the game will import history, politics, and culture into the medium unlike ever before, to say nothing of its inclusion of things like biology, medicine, or survivalism. Fans of the modern Metal Gear Solid games, so far primarily set in urban interior environments, may not have realized it. But as a series, Metal Gear has roots in a very old pastime indeed, the adventure novel, and its sister in genre fiction, the war epic. According to wisegeek.com, quote, adventure fiction is a literary subgenre featuring exciting tales of daring-do and risk-filled journeys, and strong themes pitting one person or a group against human enemies or the environment, often featuring chase sequences and strong action. Such stories tend not to be ultra-violent or gory, but rather good, clean fun. Adventure fiction dates back thousands of years to the first known stories and storytellers. One of the first such stories was Homer's Odyssey. Characters in adventure stories tend to be simple with little evolution. The good guys hold to strong moral codes and demonstrate good leadership qualities. The bad guys are devious or misguided and tend to get the just desserts at the end of the story. Such characters tend to be secondary to the main plot. Adventure fiction appeals because of its simplicity and fast pace. The action rarely lets up, and the protagonists are kept in perpetual danger. Readers simply want to know what happens next, while the key protagonist is constantly fighting for survival." End quote. It was this adventure fiction origin MGS3 would most prominently reassert, taking us as much into conflicts with our fellow man as against ourselves in our own natural landscape. But this adventure novel paradigm for Snake Eater went even further. Snake Eater used Russian baddies, villains that the US market would recognize. But, contrary to this easy-to-consume narrative that we were given, directed at the English-speaking world, in reality MGS3 will prove to be also an amoral labyrinth, just like MGS1 and 2. Underneath the skin, there was some trace resemblance to Metal Gear Solid 2. Snake Eater also began with a shorter introductory prologue-type section, before moving on to the main event. The trend the trilogy establishes is clear. In these games, there is no hard distinction between, say, heroes and madmen.
But he's a legend. Legends are usually bad news. There's not a lot of difference between heroes and madmen.
MGS2 had ended by imploring the player to realize our moral and social necessity of using all the magic of the digital age to pass traces of ourselves and our living memories, in other words, our very soul's substance, on. On this point, MGS3 will lead by example, no less so in fact than Boktai or the remake of MGS1 to lesser extents. But before any of that deeper substance can be realized, first KCE Japan must create their concept of the uncreatable game world, the living landscape.
What a fear in my heart, but you're so supreme.
The key word for MGS3 is economics. Fitting for a game set during the Cold War, that historic clash between competing economic systems, MGS3 will begin by conceptualizing a new kind of continuity, treating the player and our wider environment, as well as this individual game and the wider series, or the simple stage and the overall game, all as economic or even ecological continuums. Ecosystems, a series of interrelated loops within loops, snakes eating snakes. One point of comparison here is with the Japanese architectural school that came of age around the same epoch of MGS3's setting, metabolism. Metabolism. According to the Japanese magazine Sabukaru, quote, "From a biological point of view, the term metabolism explains chemical reactions occurring in a living body, how cells adapt and move to sustain life. Metabolism is the law of growing and living things." But also, the original Japanese version of this word overtones a spiritual perspective, closest to the Buddhist concept of impermanence, the meaning of renewal, replacement, and regeneration. Both meanings, biological and spiritual, were a frame of reference to the Metabolism Collective's designs, a step closer to an architecture based in the natural circle of life. To Metabolism, the future of Tokyo was an organic one, a bio-Tokyo, a place where the interchange of energy, resources with the ecosystem all become fundamental. Buildings that could behave as cells or grow as vegetation were indispensable factors for the plan. And at the time, Japan in the 60s, it was new emerging technologies that made this dream possible." End quote. I bring up metabolism because Snake Eater embodies a somewhat similar overall design. No one element in this game is an island. Everything has its place within the collective whole, making the game much more than merely look, but actually feel alive. Like a living, breathing, dynamic facsimile of nature and natural dynamics. To begin with comes one of the hardest things for the programmers to nail down: painstaking, handcrafted animations. Take, for example, Eva's hair as it tumbles out of her motorcycle helmet the first time you meet her. This single sequence took several days.
Damn it. He found us. You were lucky. We'll meet again.
But also, we could include here Snake Eater's bespoke handmade variegated pathways and earthen terrain. Though the Snake Eater engine will be a souped-up version of the one for MGS2, it is here, with structuring MGS3's topography, that everything the team had learned making MGS up to this point had to go right out the window. The natural world, it bends and curves into solid shapes that prior to Snake Eater had not really been attempted at this scale by a video game. This had in part to do with something called collision detection, getting the character models to recognize and accurately map over the contoured terrain. If Snake in prior titles crawled, walked, and ran along straight lines, now to become more natural, that line had to become imperfect. It had to bend and weave, and therefore become less transparently digital. Bends and breaks in that line also needed to correspond precisely with the player's movement. MGS3 would try making players one with their environment like no game had before, and this was part of how and why. Also important will be a no less difficult to construct feature for the game, MGS3's central mechanic, the camo index. Given the game's setting at the height of the Cold War, MGS3 couldn't rely on all the digital age tools and devices that players had learned to expect. But put together with the game's new kind of metabolic environments and systems, now a new basic gameplay loop was necessary. Before, Snake had infiltrated by evading the enemy via cover. The same luxuries will not be afforded in the jungle. Not only will this new terrain not sustain it, enemy sentries now no longer walk in easy-to-learn or study patrol routes. Levels now span all directions, somewhat like Ape Escape, making it difficult to know where the enemy lies. The only solution would become the title's most defining characteristic, apart from its flora and fauna-laden landscapes. Its extensive use of context-sensitive camouflage, a completely new stealth mechanic for the series, perhaps inspired by a rival one from the PC stealth series Thief. This camo index kept the player data and the environments in conversation, just like how characters within these new, bumpy, naturalistic level layouts now moved about them. Kojima will later say, quote, "The series was turning into a radar game where you just paid attention to the radar and not used your visual senses or listening. That's what I wanted people to depend on instead. So in the jungle, I wanted people to listen to the grass moving or noise. I got rid of the radar." End quote. A further host of tweaks and revisions also had to happen for other fundamentals as well. One huge change here was sound. Guards in MGS3 have, more or less for the first time, more sonic sensitivity. The alert system was reverted to the hive mind-like sentience seen in prior games, though. This and many more changes reflect a major new conceit. The idea Snake would now infiltrate not only the heart of heavily fortified enemy territory, but more like a real spy infiltrates from a distance, also the vast reaches of wilderness beyond. In this wider game world, often enemies are placed in remote pockets, far too easy to puncture for older MGS game modes. Snake Eater will carefully balance itself so that even minor confrontations with smaller groups such as these still feel like Darwinian struggles for survival. And at the core of all this is the original kernel for Kojima's very first Metal Gear, the escape and evasion game concept, which back then he had called Intruder. Far more than prior MGS games, Snake Eater would be about not only the mission itself, but also infiltration and escape. This will work because of how, similar to MGS2 but on a much grander scale, we'll begin on the periphery before gradually approaching our true mission zone, getting in and out of its center with a satisfying overall difficulty curve that corresponds exactly to the rising and falling drama of the linear central storyline. Those enemies will now be much better entrenched. The Cold War era and its hard border known as the Iron Curtain imposes unique constraints and attributes to the series that so far has largely been defined by modern warfare versus asymmetrical, borderless non-state actors like terrorists.
Here, have a cigar. It's Cuban.
In fact, most of the new gameplay applications will derive from the covert operations in enemy territory of the mother of all special forces, the British SAS, Special Air Service, during World War II. Sabotaging the enemy's logistics networks, targeting as a war of attrition their steady supply of weapons and food, poisoning them, demolishing their arms factories, even demoralizing them using psychological warfare. All this World War II era strategy now had a home in MGS. But this means depriving the player of many series staples, as I briefly touched on, from the Soliton radar to a central armory you'd return to for new ammo and guns. In every Metal Gear since 1990, there'd been a radar of some kind. But it had always been linked to gameplay. It could be temporarily jammed, for example, during alerts. MGS3 followed the logic further, putting radar and the HUD in general behind the screen and making it even more involved with gameplay, simply by turning all sensors, Ape Escape style, into items that players have to decide tactfully how and when to use. Clearly, MGS3 wanted to break players out of the Lego block box established by prior games, forcing us more than ever to use our heads, our naked senses, our own eyes and ears. Now the game's many new weapons are placed sporadically in hard-to-reach or obscure locations. Only diligent surveillance of each area could win such rewards. And that brings us to another huge advancement in MGS3, its Ape Escape-esque collectibles of medicine and food.
When you knock down a hornet's nest, a burn ointment will appear along with it, so don't forget to pick it up. Of course, the hornets aren't going to give up their nest without a fight. If you knock a nest down, a large swarm of hornets will come flying out, so be careful.
I want some more. Drop your weapon. Drop your weapon!
The gotta catch 'em all appeal to dog tags in MGS2 now entered Warp Drive, re-emerging as Snake Eater's many different varieties of flora and fauna. And in A Link to Boktai, even if not as synced with the real world, these occasionally depended on the current time of day, whether Snake was in day or night. Whereas virtually every Metal Gear before had played out over one single day, MGS3 would play out over a course of 2 weeks, even if this sense of temporality was artificed like it had been in MGS1 and 2. This longer-term mission time span necessitated totally new survivalist mechanics, like sleeping, a feature also found in Boktai, emergency medical triage, and of course catching and eating food.
It's not poisonous, but its large size makes it extremely powerful. They say it even eats crocodiles. Its only natural predator is man.
And snake.
And snake.
Got it. So how does it taste?
I knew you were going to ask me that.
This newfound vulnerability and blindness couldn't have contrasted more from MGS1 and 2, where hardcore stimulants and nanotechnology had liberated the protagonists from such earthly concerns. And this newfound vulnerability and blindness brought the enduring conceit of on-site procurement, a series staple, to a new frontier. Now Snake had to steal not just gear and information, but also medicine and food. Crucially, these new features had gameplay dynamics of their own, and thanks to the influence of Vice City from the west and Ape Escape from the east, suddenly MGS is growing into a kind of full-fledged pseudo-sandbox type game, with tons of different, multiply realizable ways forward. MGS3 will even verge on open world at times. Now, apart from the main mission, players could at any time deviate on a path all of their own, hunting new prey or exploring optional areas off the beaten trail. Often in MGS3, many different paths forward are possible. All that really matters is choosing one of your own. Learning from MGS2's substance, now the dev team made gameplay and the player's particular play style much more central to the entire experience. The game was also full of ways to bully, berate, and sadistically even torture our stand-in for Raiden, the character Raidenovich. Yet all this newfound importance of the player and their gameplay style, KCE Japan accomplished without making story take a back seat. Simply by making MGS3 a much larger game, with room for lots of both story and gameplay. This will get MGS3 closer to the live, player-driven experience that Kojima had recognized as crucial to the appeal of online games, right alongside the first installment, released with MGS3 Substance in 2005, of Metal Gear Online. But simultaneously, Snake Eater will go beyond even the Hollywood aspirations of its predecessor to become perhaps the ultimate playable movie of its era. Drawing on vintage cinematic influences like The Great Escape and Dr. Strangelove, but also more modern ones like Predator and even Austin Powers, MGS3 will also be the kind of tragic, morally gray, disenchanted spy story that we might associate with one of its largest literary influences, spy author John le Carre. Rich with irony, MGS3 as a prequel will harness a new kind of foreshadowing, all while using the past, both the pasts of fact and fiction, inside the game and out, to comment on the past, the present, and even philosophize about the future. MGS3 debuts worldwide November 17, 2004. It's the first MGS with a global, universal release. This is computer entertainment of a grandeur, spectacle, and scale that as of 2004 is simply unprecedented, and what few people realize is how crucial to this evolution Twin Snakes proved to be. From the similar openings to the similar style of action, it's clear Kojima learned a lot from Ryuhei Kitamura about shooting action scenes. Kitamura had specialized in two things: cinematic anime adaptations and sci-fi action. As I touched on, the same year as Twin Snakes, Kitamura directed the 50th year anniversary themed Godzilla movie Final Wars. Curiously, Godzilla and the subject of his 50-year reign will deeply inform Kojima's MGS3. What Raiden from MGS2 had been to King Kong, Snake in MGS3, and the man we know he'll later become, Big Boss, will be to that original nuclear leviathan, Godzilla.
Nuclear test, huh? Then the Marshall Islands must be crawling with giant monsters right about now.
It's just make-believe.
Maybe that's why my pants have been so tight lately.
Snake, it's a movie, not a report out of Los Alamos.
Motion capture will be used much more extensively than it had been in MGS2, largely as a byproduct of Kojima working with Kitamura on the Twin Snakes. Even non-action-packed moments will utilize constant mocapping to give each character a realistic feel, yet many difficult renders will still be required to be done by hand, as I mentioned, like Eva's hair. An added benefit to this was now the mocap actors themselves influenced MGS3 in numerous ways, making it better. The gesture Ocelot makes to Snake, for example, was the actor's idea. Meanwhile, in one intimately close scene between Snake and Eva, the mocap actor for Snake was so struck by the one for Eva's beauty up close that he froze. This momentary lust paralysis made it into the actual game. And the mocap actor for Granin really got wasted to shoot this scene. Kojima would later say that it was a complete disaster, and also extremely hilarious. Yet there was another new element to cutscenes, camo consistency between story and gameplay. This actually went back to Sons of Liberty, where Raiden could wear the enemy uniform as well as wigs and glasses during cutscenes. Work on Snake Eater began before Twin Snakes, more or less right after the completion of MGS2, and it all began with that starring role, the game environment. After creating a level experiment to prove that such a lush and organic world was at least possible, the team then crafted MGS3's special engine, and took more lessons from military advisor Motosada Mori. This time, Mori teaches about survival, camouflage, and the like. Snake Eater would be born from the marriage between these three main centers: Mori's survival techniques and CQC, Kitamura's movie techniques, and Kojima's writing, both as a former child of the 1960s and a present legend of game design. Ape Escape, on the other hand, used Sony's DualShock analog controller in intriguing and unique ways, like I said, ways that MGS3 will certainly emulate, albeit in less dramatic fashion. No, Snake Eater won't make the right analog stick as an Ape Escape-style directional attack. It will continue in the vein of MGS2, rooting the entire game in a special storytelling register that we might call, fittingly, as we'll see given MGS3's objectives, philosophy, and themes, third-person limited view, or subjective own view. Even Ape Escape featured a 360-degree camera system, albeit one that you use with the D-pad. But given its themes, and out of consistency with MGS2, Snake Eater's limited camera dovetailed with the series' wider aspirations to challenge cinema, to make the right stick a limited, player-controlled third-person viewpoint. Seeing the full size and activity in these often massive winding open expanses with this camera required moving or risking making with the sonar item a telling sound. You couldn't get that level of information on the area for free anymore. Western players preferred the more conventional 360-degree camera style of MGS's rival on Xbox, Splinter Cell, and soon enough, with MGS3's own substance-style expansion, Subsistence, in 2005, the masses would get their wish. And there's no question on the user end that this camera change was welcome. But this unquestionably marked a crucial turning point, not only for Metal Gear, but for perhaps the entire medium. Western game trends and norms now carried more clout than Japanese ones. This would be a serious subject to be tackled in the next game, Metal Gear Solid 4: Guns of the Patriots. Apart from the unusual 3D camera style, Snake Eater, again similarly to Ape Escape 1 and 2, also did something different for the D-pad, drawing inspiration from series veteran military advisor Motosada Mori's lectures in the mountains about wars of attrition and jungle stealth. The D-pad now lets Snake stalk, moving silently at the expense of speed and maneuverability. While, as we mentioned, there was some influence played on the visual design of the game by Zone of the Enders 2, meanwhile, most of the rest of MGS3's gear, weapons, and vehicles are careful replicas made mostly from experimental or rarely seen prototypes from the mid-century era, in a fitting connection to the game's influenced Dr. Strangelove, which had astounded and even alarmed American military officials with the accuracy of its model bomber. Vehicles in MGS3, like the Hercules C-130 that the game begins with, will be similarly praised for its perfect accuracy. The special aircraft on which Snake and Eva make their great escape, the Wig, is recreated from a famous fleeting photograph. While the enemy's floating platforms, the boss's Davy Crockett portable nuke, and many other artifacts seen in the game, like Eva's Triumph motorbike at the end, are all studiously modeled from the real world. But this conceit of immersing players in the flavor of the age extended to cutscenes. Just as had MGS1 and 2, Snake Eater uses real footage at various times. But given its historical bent, MGS3 would use stock footage and documentation like no MGS before or since. This real material became subtly blended in with what by MGS3 becomes a tradition, occasionally using concept art or other illustrations in what the dev team lovingly titled MGS's Shinkawa theater scenes. All this gave Snake Eater a much-needed visual dynamicism, playing off the art of Yoji Shinkawa to offer several unique registers for cutscenes to play out in. (2002's GTA Vice City had arguably first introduced to modern gaming the idea of a period piece, like I said. And as mentioned, Snake Eater will follow its example to become maybe the perfection of the period piece idea, until of course the start of a different Rockstar series a decade later, Red Dead Redemption, a series that will, by so emulating all the best aspects of MGS3, return the compliment. Set in the turbulent year 1964, Snake Eater is a version of the era rarely if ever portrayed in a game before. Though many are aware of the late 60s thanks to countless American movies and period pop records, the early half of the decade is often overlooked. Snake Eater will portray the early 60s as very much an epoch of transition, one with military, scientific, and technological trappings that we scarcely but sometimes do recognize. The obvious touchstone here is, of course, Bond, James Bond. But even if MGS3 will derive a lot from, say, Dr. No, From Russia with Love, and Goldfinger, the game will remain rooted in a genre rarely seen in Bond films, science fiction. The result will be a compelling hybrid of influences and genres, at once both referential and compellingly unique. And though Snake Eater will redefine once more the industry standard for the cinematic, to better compete with both Western games and also movies, a huge degree of focus will go towards gameplay and interaction. It is here Boktai and its resource managing, its essential economic structure will be brought to bear. And combined with Vice City's retro-futurist open-endedness and Ape Escape's bonkers technicians' control schemes. This focus on synthesizing influences to refine the mechanics and systems of gameplay stems from an important revelation. Recognizing that the medium will never have a bigger shift than the one in the late 90s and the early 2000s from 2D to 3, Kojima realizes with Snake Eater that graphics and visuals in the future will follow the law of diminishing returns. MGS1 and 2 made great emphasis on their visuals, how they would use this emerging 3D technology to become something new, if less than real. By MGS3, the shape of things in the medium to come is more or less set in stone. As Kojima will explain to GameSpy in 2004, quote, "Visuals and sound cannot become much better than they are now. Now we have a great opportunity to make games better internally, in story, expression, things like that," end quote. Like a space shuttle, MGS3 will explore in new ways, places and objects we never knew existed, covering, for example, things like SIGINT, the conception of the digital age, or via outfits like the SAS, the birth of special forces as we know them today. But this exploration of change over time MGS3 offers will have a fourth wall breaking component, as Snake Eater will be deeply invested in past pre-MGS Kojima games. Chief among them is Policenauts, where Snake Eater derives much of its fixation on the space race, and the partial inspiration for its best character, the boss, namely the Policenauts character Karen Hojo, who very nearly made a cameo as a newscaster at the end of Metal Gear Solid 2. The boss, that character that defies hard definitions of either enemy or friend, of mother, sister, or lover, is easily the most important MGS character, both for the series and the medium. Apart from Karen Hojo, or for that matter Grey Fox in MGS1, the boss would not have been possible without a very crucial influence, Zone of the Enders. Spoilers for both Zone games and the end of MGS3 incoming, so skip to this time to avoid them. At the end of Zone 1, protagonist Leo Stenbuck's pacifist ideals come crashing down when he's forced to fatally wound his game-long antagonist, Viola. She begs, in a scene directly alluded to by MGS3, for you to kill her.
What's with you? Kill me.
And later in that game, your orbital frame Jehuti's AI, Ada, sacrifices itself to faithfully carry out its mission.
What about you?
All my functions aboard Jehuti will cease. This is what I live for. This is the purpose of living for those who have no life.
These may have been the seeds of the boss's dramatic and unforgettable arc in MGS3, an arc that played off the inevitability of a game's final boss battle in medium-specific revolutionary ways. Bosses had rarely been characters whose player relationship was this personal, this intimate, or this heartbreaking. If MGS3 endures today and the day after tomorrow as a timeless legend that changed the medium's whole world, it is no doubt, at least in part, because of the boss, her tragedy and her sacrifice, her death spent fighting ever more courageously a battle she was always preordained to lose.
Think back. When I was leading the Cobras, America and Russia were fighting together. Now, consider whether America and Russia will still be enemies in the 21st century. Somehow I doubt it. Enemies change along with the times, the flow of the ages, and we soldiers are forced to play along. I didn't raise you and shape you into the man you are today just so we could face each other in battle. A soldier's skills aren't meant to be used to hurt friends. So then what is an enemy? Is there such a thing as an absolute timeless enemy? There is no such thing, and never has been. And the reason is that our enemies are human beings like us. They can only be our enemies in relative terms.
The phase where Kojima had tried to match the power and influence of movies is over. Now he's focused exclusively on making MGS3 something totally interactive, something completely different from film that film could never dream of being.
But first, let's take a look at your body, shall we? What a beautiful body you have, like a newborn baby.
Surely the reaction globally to MGS2 had been part of this, but it also reflects the meteoric rise of the medium itself in the early 21st century. Games matter now not as pale imitations of cinema, but strictly as games. They no longer have to emulate or disguise themselves as a different thing. The distinction between games and movies, largely thanks to the unifying lingua franca that is the PS2 and the DVD, has never been more clear, ironically enough. Movies and games being on the same platform for Kojima solidified the very underlying hard distinction dividing them. For years, Kojima had tried to think like one of his heroes, like a Stanley Kubrick-class director or a David Bowie-style musician.
Can you hear me, Major Tom?
Snake Eater marks the turning point, the point Kojima fully embraces his role and that of the medium, both as something impossible to emulate. But just what was this thing only games, and Hideo Kojima games in particular, could achieve or become? Apart from their inherent reliance on interactivity, for Kojima the answer seems to be what he'll call the inside factor. In other words, lived human experience, novelistic and philosophical attributes expressed via interaction in ways that no other medium could.
I've caught you at last. We are the sons of the boss. Ha! I am the pain. Ha! I will guide you to a world of anguish beyond your imagination. Let's get started.
Unfortunately, it is this very ideal of using games to express interactively the inside that will bind Kojima to the very series from which he has fully intended to defect. Because his design relies so completely on Kojima's own inside, his own experiences, for example, growing up in the mid-20th century, there's really no one else capable but him of pulling it off. If there's one enduring norm at the heart of video games, one original sin, surely it is the boss fight. This was ironically, in a fourth wall-breaking way, already being commented on by the original Metal Gear and its character, Big Boss. For Hideo Kojima, as much as games now needed to change internally, in terms of themes and subject matter, so too did they need to change in terms of formal structure. Core concepts and building blocks, including that of the boss fight, had to be reimagined. If games as a medium were to ever escape the endless diminishing returns of a growing East versus West graphical arms race. The degree of open-endedness to boss fights in MGS3 alone is itself revolutionary. You could go so far as saying the concept of boss battles is perfected by this game. And as always, this is true for both narrativity and gameplay. MGS3 will prove to be an embarrassment of riches, many different mini-revolutions in one. Repeatedly, the title will showcase new features and design ideas never before seen in a game, or for that matter, anywhere else. Like the time paradox that results from changing history, or the fake death pill, or the trip down the River of the Dead, the eons-length sniper battle, the secret items, collectibles, and mechanics. Other examples include one scene that uses pressure-sensitive eyelids, or another, a real-life trick shooter and former Godzilla suit actor, Mitsuho Tornado Yoshida. The mocap cast was carefully chosen to give each character their own sense of humanity, own genuine way of moving and sense of self, of their inside, all the human things the naked eye can sense but not directly see. The game will utilize huge and spectacular set pieces, requiring building equally huge props and sets, just as to a lesser extent had Twin Snakes. MGS3 has attempted spectacle on a scale rivaled only by perhaps such Hollywood epics as Cecil B. DeMille's, and periods in cinematic history like the boom in war and historical epics of the late 50s to early 60s. However, historical sci-fi is hardly a typical genre in cinema or really any other medium. For all its respect and love for classic Hollywood, for British espionage and 19th century adventure fiction, MGS3 is decisively designed only as a game. For this, we return to that underlying conceptual conceit for MGS3 that I mentioned. Not economics, but the human interior, the inside, the stuff we classify as lived experience, sometimes called by pretentious philosophers phenomenology. MGS3 sets out to portray this vital dimension to human existence, so threatened perhaps by the scientifically predicated and technologically mediated information age, in ways only a game could. However, perhaps as a consequence, many of MGS3's deepest themes and ideas will actually get lost in translation as it moves from east to west. Divisions and disharmony between Kojima and the English localization of MGS games goes back to MGS1. Though largely seen worldwide as definitive, the English dubs of MGS are actually somewhat different by necessity from the originals. Even by MGS3, a foul wind is blowing for beloved voice actor for Snake, David Hayter. Kojima tries replacing him with Kurt Russell. The difference between screen and voice actors in the US is rather different than in Japan. And Kojima, as a Japanese, likely thinks of Snake primarily not as Hayter, like the rest of the world, but actually as his Japanese voice actor, Akio Otsuka. But whoever his voice talent, the real Snake is of course a composite, one that includes the player ourselves. Take for example the new design idea of certain scenes that we can live through and experience from behind Snake's own blue eyes, maybe the best illustration of the importance for Snake Eater of the inside human world. In English, the prompt for these moments is simply the corresponding button, R1. But in its native tongue, these become shukan, a Japanese phrase loaded with different meanings. Shukan can mean own view, but also subjectively, subject, and ego. The idea hinted at by this phrase, shukan, is this viewpoint won't be neutral or objective. It will be taken from the inside out. This shukan or own view conceit joined cutscenes with gameplay in a perfect marriage of East and West. The story fixation of the East with the interaction fixation of the West. Another fun feature of the own view is that during cutscenes, you could choose whether to view them in real time or as a cutscene, oscillating back and forth. Clearly, again, another response to the criticism of MGS2 being not interactive enough, because now the player could control even the delivery of the story in subtle ways. Other homages designed for Western audiences included to 24 and The Mummy, as well as to the comic book Spawn when the Fury's face gets burned. And at the very end of the game, apart from Star Wars,
Snake, try to remember some of the basics of CQC.
We also saw a reference to a film that came out during the game's development that was popular worldwide, Jet Li's Hero. Other key touchstones for MGS3 would of course include Apocalypse Now and Deer Hunter, as well as many samurai and spaghetti western flicks, as well as television series like Kamen Rider. But more than merely ape Kitamura's style, with MGS3, Kojima dramatically established his bona fides as an action cinematographer. Another example of getting lost in translation is the famous saying between Snake and young Ocelot, "You're pretty good." Impossible to translate directly, in reality this line means in Japanese something like, "You've got a good mind, a good inside, good senses." Again, we find the theme of life as lived from inside the skull. Among the biggest illustrations of MGS3's phenomenological or experiential side has to be the femme fatale Eva. She seduces us in real time, in a kind of direct, unmediated way that other mediums could only dream of, showing only as much or as little of her naked truth, her Edenic apple, her secret intelligence, as we, via Shukan interaction, elect. Even without the tool of the real-time own view R1, character dynamics and relationships fitting with the metabolism style develop pseudo-organically over time. In Eva's case, for example, through most of the game, Snake is shy and unsure of whether to trust her, yet he's unbelievably attracted to her. This the game portrays via own view modes that fixate on her body. But by the end, Snake grows. He learns to look at Eva as equals. Own view here, looking her in the face. Snake overcomes his initial shy, pervy stealthiness, expressed in ways that only a game could. But other examples here are legion. In a callback to the design of MGS1, the more that you call someone in Snake Eater, the more your relationship with them grows, indicated by unlocked content like new photos and intel. And a certain Russian upstart we meet in the game, Revolver Ocelot, develops with you over the game a kind of dynamic that in its own weird way mimics yours and Eva's, one changing as it were with the times, like a living thing, a metabolism. And that brings us to MGS3's biggest theme, where human nature meets human mind, namely human relativity.
Hey, you're not such a bad guy after all. I guess not all Americans are dogs.
You mean it?
Yeah. You know, before the war started, I used to live in America. I even had a wife and a kid.
You must be pretty lonely.
Yeah, I am pretty lonely. Really lonely.
What's your kid's name?
Johnny.
Johnny. Nice ring to it.
In this new era, the global war on terrorism, both sides will label the other a born enemy, and their conflict necessary, natural, and eternal, ignoring all history prior to the new Year Zero, September 11th, 2001. Snake Eater posed a challenge to this militant orthodoxy and all its tragic ironies. Using the early 60s backdrop of the Cold War, MGS3 comments on the modern era, all eras of human events, past, present, and future. Borrowing a page from 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, for Snake Eater, the only human absolute is that there is none. Values, ideas, morals, politics, they aren't set in stone. As much as every Kojima game had dealt with fate before now, it was with Snake Eater the creator imposed a new concept to complicate all notions of destiny, the concept of, roughly, as I said, human relativity, also sometimes called perspectivism. A concept that fed as much into the story as gameplay. This concept was first introduced perhaps by at least MGS2. In that game, not even the sci-fi superintelligent AIs, the Patriots, can manage a foolproof system of total control or completely artificial human will. History, they themselves explain, is contingent, is not even past, is living and growing in the lives and the minds of the ones living today. History and what it means depends on the context imposed by a given now, a new and newer present tense. In that sense, though facts do not typically ever change, their interpretations change drastically, coiling like snakes to suit new eras and serve as substitute for new epochs. And often how these interpretations play out gets dictated in top-down fashion, beyond any one person's power or consciousness to control, by the times, those epochs themselves. As every MGS has so far stunningly fictionalized, with the nuclear age, the potential destructive power of war and military machines grew to such intensity and horrific scale that interpretation no longer could risk getting left to the masses. The result from World War II to the global war on terror has been a series of paradoxes where people are expected both to treat the present enemy as absolute evil and to be able to switch targets, switch concepts for enemies and friends practically on command, all just as a certain George Orwell perhaps prophesized years ago. MGS3 showcased and challenged all this status quo on both the macro and micro scale. On the macro, the game portrays the insane arms races, backroom double dealings, and incipient hypocrisy definitive of at least the Cold War, if not by extension all politics since at least the start of the 20th century. But on the micro scale, MGS3 depicted its philosophy of relativity and dramatic existential human freedom via tragedy, the one between Snake and his mentor, the game's chief antagonist, the boss, whose relationship, wordless in its profundities, knows no east or west, has no common tongue with the wider world. That's what will make MGS3 so compelling as historical fiction. It isn't that playing as the future big boss changes the story or characters or lore established by previous games. What it changes is not content at all, but rather context. It makes a version of the past wordlessly alive, because its characters are no mere set dressing. Like any Hideo Kojima game, everything in Snake Eater coincides. Everything matters, and matters not only in isolation, but collectively, organically, metabolically as a set. Your mission as Naked Snake, the once and future big boss and series arch-villain, is to kill your own former mentor and the love of your life, the boss, and all because that secret, true, and ultimate antagonist for the series behind everything, the thing that will truly drive you to become the evil madman. Not the Patriots or any other shadowy entity, but the times themselves. Politics, we're told, determined the lines lacerating all battlefields, and politics, Snake Eater warns us, are a living thing. This man versus the times conflict was a fundamentally, if arguably, new form of storytelling, one entirely only possible as a prequel video game. As such, it allowed for Snake Eater to craft an idiosyncratic form of what's known as retroactive continuity or retconning. I hope with this video to coin a new phrase for MGS3 on this point. I call it ret texting. The easiest way to understand it is by simply looking at our main character, the future big boss, aka Naked Snake, or Jack.
For 10 years, we lived and died together. You couldn't possibly understand.
And you think you can kill her now? That's your mission, isn't it? Assassinating the boss? Snake? Is there anyone you like? Someone special?
I've never been interested in other people's lives.
You were interested in the boss.
She was different.
Really? How do you feel about me?
I should be asking you the same question.
Me? I can fall in love if it's part of the mission. Even with you. Is there anyone you like?
I've never been interested in anyone else's life.
So you are all alone.
Through the power of ret texting, old characters, settings, and storylines by MGS3 are given retroactively new life, merely by allowing players to see them in a totally new light. For example, we learn Revolver Ocelot's backstory, totally changing the nature of his character in prior games. And indirectly, we learn even of the origin of MGS2's shadowy cabal, the Patriots. Snake Eater tells us they began at the turn of the 20th century as a group of actual people, not AIs, called the Philosophers. Much needed context for the prior 4 Metal Gear games got provided, enriching them retroactively and reinventing their possible interpretations for future generations.
The boss wouldn't be allowed to come back home alive. And she wouldn't be allowed to kill herself. Her life would be ended by her most beloved disciple. That was the way the government wanted it. That was the mission she was given, and she had no choice but to carry it out. Her death at your hands was a duty she had to fulfill. Out of duty, she turned her back on her own comrades. A lesser woman would have been crushed by such a burden. The taint of disgrace will follow her to her grave. Future generations will revile her.
Yet by doing so, MGS3's underlying tragic themes also became more manifest, even if memories or memes of people and events endure what they really meant in their own time. As a byproduct of the times and its given era of human imagination, all that is only alive for as long as we are. The true or original meaning of a thing MGS3 follows MGS2 to say depends on its original and ongoing contexts. And that is something derived or dictated from the macro, from the times, and experienced on the scale of the micro, by our living minds, from the inside, from our Shukan. In an interview in 2003 about Boktai, Hideo Kojima said this: "The concept of a battle that's fought despite knowing it's a lost cause is actually a pattern that reappears in all my games." End quote. In MGS3, that impossible struggle we fight, whether in terms of story or gameplay, is again against the times. The times, whose very shifts over the ages, ironically, are what made a historical science fiction prequel like MGS3 possible. A beautiful and haunting masterwork with few rivals in any time, MGS3 Snake Eater truly went down in history as one of the greats. It's just that its context, the deeper meaning it represented, and still continues to represent today, will, is, and was locked in an endless chain reaction, an existence of endless battle and nomadic existential wandering, one never, as a game of interpretation, to be game over. Utilizing design traditions of both East and West, straddling as socio-political philosophy both past and present, MGS3 at bottom was a mind-blowing glimpse of the medium's future. But as we'll see next entry, in 2008's MGS4 Guns of the Patriots, that future would prove to be dystopian, one where the Shukan, the senses, the self, will be driven like a snake forced to consume itself by a parasite from the inside out. Until next time, boss.